2009. This movie refreshed the minds of millions of viewers when it was released. It also made countless fighters break their defenses. The 5-star top team. Every day, the inmates in the prison are provided with plenty of food, but hundreds of people still starve to death. The plot is so absurd, but it's the same as the reality. And what's even more frightening is that audiences of all ages and economic levels will have different feelings after watching this movie. He is the once sensational suspense movie. Hunger Station. The boy is not a criminal, but he wants to go to jail. I didn't expect to hear such an outrageous proposal. The staff was not surprised to hear such an outrageous proposal, because 1,000 people had already come forward. 1,000 people had already offered to go to jail. In order to compete for a place in jail, the guy said he was willing to donate all of his millions of dollars in savings. The staff, who love money, would not say no. Can you believe that the guy wants to go to jail so badly? He wants to go to jail so badly because he wants to enjoy the luxurious food inside. Don't underestimate the food, because it's going to haunt anyone who tastes it. When Glenn opened his eyes again, and he found himself in prison, just like he wanted to be. His cellmate was an eccentric old man. Glenn tried to say hello out of courtesy, but then the old white man told him, "Please take your seat." Glenn took a look around the prison. It's like a big building. There's a square hole in the center, from the top and the bottom. You can't see the whole place from the top or the bottom. Then came the news. The food served in the prison is a 5-star meal, but they only get the scraps. Old white told Glenn, "The floor we're on is 48. Glenn woke up on such a high floor. It's a good thing he woke up on a floor this high. Glenn wanted to say hello to the next person, but the white man stopped him. Glenn wanted to say hello to the people above him, but the white man stopped him again. You can't talk to people who aren't in the same class. It's impossible to talk to people who aren't in the same class." Glenn then realized that the old white seems to be very familiar with this place. It turns out that old boy has been locked up for a year already. Prisoners stay on each floor for about a month. The lowest floor he's been on is the 132nd floor. Soon after, food was dropped from the sky on a large platform. All the food on the plate was leftovers from other people's meals. Old boy rushed up and ate it all. But Glenn, on the other hand, looked disgusted, so he didn't move his mouth. Then he looked up. There were 47 floors up there. There are 2 people on each floor. That means 94 people have eaten this food. However, old boy was devouring it with great gusto. Then he realized there was still half a bottle of wine. You took a big gulp. The old white man advised Glenn that you'd better eat something, or you'll regret it. So that's all you get in a day. Glenn looked around for a while. He took out an untouched apple and put it in his pocket. At that moment, the elevator continued to descend. Old white threw the bottle down after finishing his drink and spat on the bottom. Glenn wondered why he did it. The white man said, "Someone poops on the food. The people below will still eat it. After all, if you don't eat it, you'll starve to death." After eating, the white man went to bed, but the temperature in the room was rising rapidly. Glenn asked why. The white man said calmly, "We'll burn to the ground soon. The reason is that you've left your food on you. If you don't get rid of the food, the temperature will continue to rise." Glenn immediately dropped the apple. The temperature finally began to drop. We learned that Glenn entered this prison of his own accord. When he entered, everyone was allowed to bring one thing. Glenn brought Don Quixote. The white man was happy to hear that, because White brought a knife. He had to kill someone to get in. The next day, when the food came down, Whitey was still munching away. Glenn sat on the bed and watched him. The food had been spoiled. It was really hard for him to swallow. On the 3rd day, Glenn was finally hungry enough to try a bite of food. No one in this world can stand hunger. Just as the old white man was passing the time by carving on the wall with his knife, a man suddenly fell from above. Glenn showed a shocked expression, but the old white man said calmly, "This is normal." In the eyes of the old white man, human life is not worth much. He was glad to have more food. For such a ridiculous thing, Glenn let out a roar, but everyone chose to look on with indifference. As the food was brought down again, Glenn realized there was a woman sitting on the platform, but she was covered in bruises. Glenn tried to touch Amy, but Amy avoided him. The white man told him, "This woman comes down once a month. She was looking for her son." Glenn reached out his hand and reassured Amy that she'd be all right. Amy is not an ordinary person. In order to come down with the food, he'd kill his own cellmates. He's the one who killed the guy who fell from the top, and he did it for a reason: to see his son at the bottom. Glenn got a surprised look on his face when he heard that. Old white went on to tell him, "The only way to get out of jail is if your cellmate dies, or released. The one who's left gets to go to the top." And Amy stayed up there almost all the time, which only meant he killed a lot of people. Whitey's been in prison a year. He must have killed people too. As the food platform continues to descend, Glenn watched Amy uneasily. The elevator stopped at the 49th floor. 2 men dragged him down. Then a few screams came from inside the building. Glenn's heart raced as he listened from above. He wanted to jump down and get Amy, but he didn't have the courage. The white man was always there to encourage him. "Jump, if you fall to your death. Next month, I'll be able to go up to a higher floor." At that moment, the screams downstairs turned into men. When Amy reappeared in Glenn's sights, Amy had already killed 2 men. Glenn realized this woman was good. Over the next few days, Glenn got to know the old white man better. The 2 of them got along quite harmoniously. Glenn also gradually adapted to the life here, began to like the old white, eat and drink a lot. A month passed like this. Soon it was time to change floors. The room suddenly smelled of anesthetics. Everyone fell asleep from the smell. When Glenn woke up again, he found himself tied to the bed. He screamed in pain. At that moment, Old White came over with a knife. They were assigned to the 171st floor. This is not a good floor. When the food landed here, must have been eaten up. In order to prevent himself from starving to death in this month, Old White tied up Glenn. Old White planned to use Glenn as his own food, so that after Glenn's death, he can go back to the top next month. But Whitey wanted to starve Glenn for a week first. The best time to eat him was when his bowels were empty. That's when another one fell. Glenn realized, this is a place where people eat people. But by now he was still naive enough to think that he could convince the white man to let him go. The white man is not a human being. He thinks of Glenn as a snail. In a week's time, he'll eat Glenn. It didn't take long. The food was brought down. The white man went up and took a look. Even the plate was licked clean. The old white man swept the plate down in anger. He used his knife to cut off a piece of meat from his cellmate's leg. He was going to put it in his mouth and eat it. Glenn screamed his heart out. But then Amy jumped down from the platform and punched the old white man in the face. Maybe it was because of the kindness that Glenn showed to Amy that he was touched. So he was going to help Glenn for once. He used his knife to cut the cloth on Glenn's body. Glenn crawled towards the white man step by step. He stabbed him several times. The old white man was killed. Then Amy cut off the white man's flesh and gave it to Glenn for food. Glenn was able to recover under his care. Amy went on to find her son. For the next month, Glenn had to eat the rotting flesh of the old white man. His consciousness slipped away. It was like the white man was living in his brain. He would come out and talk to him. That night, the room once again smelled like anesthesia. Glenn slipped into a coma in the midst of his obsessive fantasies with Amy. When he woke up again, he was assigned to the 33rd floor. This time his cellmate was a woman with a dog. Glenn chatted with him for a while before he remembered. This is the interviewer who recruited me. At the time of the initial interview, Suzanne asked Glenn about his hobbies and favorite food in detail, because they would add his favorites to the menu, according to the portion. There should be enough food, but since the people at the top can eat whatever they want, there's not enough food for the people on the bottom. The lower you go, the less resources you have. Like Glenn, Susan came in voluntarily. He wanted to do his part to change the unequal distribution of resources. Glenn asked Susan, how many floors are there in this prison? Susan said 200, and then the food came down. Glenn started to eat it. Susan divides the food into 2 portions, and then he took turns eating it with the dog in his arms. He would never waste food. After the elevator went down, Susan talked to the people below. Mind your own business, he said. Glenn just thought it was stupid what Susan was doing. There's no such thing as spontaneous solidarity in the face of profit. Susan continued to do the same thing day in and day out, convinced that she could change people's minds. One day Glenn couldn't stand it any longer. He yelled at the people below him. The people below him had to be quiet. Only when their own interests are threatened, they'll stop what they're doing. On this day, when the food came down again, there was a man lying on top of it. The injured Amy. Since Amy had saved her life once before, Glenn immediately took him to bed and tended to his wounds. At that moment, the 3 of them realized that the temperature was dropping rapidly. Glenn saw Susan's dog with food in its mouth. The rule here is you don't leave food behind. Or it's hot or it's cold. Glenn immediately snatched the food from the dog's mouth and threw it down. The temperature finally returned to normal. That night, Glenn was suddenly awakened by the sound of 2 women making noise. It turned out that Amy had secretly eaten Susan's dog in the middle of the night. After Amy's injuries healed, Amy continued to look for her son. But Susan told Glenn that it was impossible to have a child, because no one under 16 is allowed in here, and that Amy had volunteered. Susan was the one who interviewed him. Susan made sure she didn't have a kid with her. That's why she went down to look for a child. It's possible that Amy made up a lie. Now we're in the back of the kitchen where the food is prepared. Every chef here is a 5-star chef. Every ingredient they make is exquisite. There's no room for error in the presentation. But as soon as the food is served, it's being destroyed by a pack of wolves. When the food was delivered to the 33rd floor, it was completely destroyed. But it was lucky enough. At least they had something to eat. Glenn saw an untouched plate of snails. It was his favorite food before he went to prison. But Susan wouldn't eat it, because today it was his dog's turn to eat. A month passed quickly. When Glenn woke up again, he found himself on the 202nd floor. Susan had hung herself in her room, because when he was an interviewer, the management told him that there were 200 floors. Apparently they lied to Susan. Glenn looked down. It's still as deep as it's ever been. Suddenly, Glenn's voice came back to him. He told him to eat Susan. It was the only way to survive the month. But Glenn was also in a quandary. And then Susan's voice came into his head. Susan told Glenn to eat him too. It might be the last thing in the world for him. Glenn was in deep pain. When the food arrived on the 202nd floor, the plates were licked clean. And Glenn realized, if I don't eat Susan, I'm not gonna make it. In the end, he cut Susan's skin with a knife. And for a month, he suffered in agony. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself on the 6th floor. This time it was a very high floor, meaning he would have plenty of food. His cellmate was an old black man. Blackie had a rope hanging from his body. He wanted to use the rope to climb to the top floor, the rope and escape from the prison. At this point, he begged the higher-ups to help him, so they could get out of this hellhole together. But what he didn't realize, but the people on the 5th floor refused his request. When Blackie was in despair, suddenly, the man on the 5th floor poked his head out and said, "I'm willing to help him." Blackie threw the rope up. He came over to Glenn and said, I'll see you again. Then he climbed up the rope. Who knew that within a meter of climbing, the guy up there threw poop on him on purpose. He was about to fall straight down. In a moment of crisis, the kind-hearted Glenn pulled him back in time, but his rope fell down. Blackie let out a roar of despair. At that moment, the food came down, but Blackie wasn't even in the mood to eat. Glenn threw him an apple. Blackie had just taken 2 bites, and the platform went down. He had no choice but to drop the apple. Late at night, Glenn's voice would ring in his head. Old White told him, "Must eat more this month, because next month there won't be such a good chance to be high up again." At that moment, the white man's face was replaced by Susan's. The two men have completely different views. Susan still believes in the law of fair distribution, so he encouraged Glenn to help himself to everything he wanted to do. Glenn was actually like Susan. He's a sunny guy with a sunny heart. He felt that he should do something, so he said to Blackie, "As long as someone controls the fair distribution of food, there will be no uneven distribution of resources between floors. The people on the lower floors won't have to kill each other anymore. In this way, everyone will be able to survive." Blackie was persuaded by Glenn. They found 2 steel pipes in the room to use as weapons. Then they stood on the platform and landed with the food. They think the first 50 floors have been eating and drinking all day, so it's okay to go on hunger strike for a day. So they started distributing food from the 51st floor. Once someone approaches the platform, the 2 of them would warn them to leave quickly. At this time, suddenly, someone called out Blackie's name. This person was Blackie's teacher. He is a wise man, so Blackie respected him. When he found out that Blackie and Glenn were going to share the food equally with everyone, the teacher expressed his support, but he approved of the violence they used, and believed that the problem had to be solved at the root of the problem. The best way to do this was to pass on what was going on down below to the management up above. Eventually, the pair chose a plate of parfait. They had to make sure it was intact, so Blackie kept it in his hands. When they got to the next floor, Glenn decided to negotiate with the people inside. If they don't agree, if they didn't agree, they just beat them up. But it turns out that there was no such thing as a peaceful negotiation, so the 2 of them ended up using violence against everyone until they came to the 51st floor. They served food to the people inside. Although their portions were limited, they were able to make sure that everyone had enough to eat. When they reached the 96th floor, they found that the old man inside had been knocked out by the boy. Glenn gave the old man a bowl of soup, and the boy told him he was going to die, because only if he kills the old man, he can only go back to the top next month. Glenn was suddenly shocked by his cruelty and viciousness, and the further down they went, the more people died. On several floors, they were all dead. As long as no one eats the food, the platform wouldn't stop. At that moment, the 2 of them heard a heartbreaking scream from the floor below. It turns out Amy had found her way here to look for her son. One of the men was stabbing him with a knife. Glenn saw this and jumped down to fight the men. Another man tried to help, but Blackie kicked him away. Unfortunately, the situation was quickly reversed. Blackie was cut by another man with a knife, and Glenn was pushed to the ground by his opponent, until Glenn was about to be choked to death by the men. Blackie stabbed the man in the back. Glenn tried to get up to see how Amy was doing, but the platform was about to drop. Blackie had to force him onto the platform. When they saw someone in the room, they'd throw some food down. Eventually, the platform stopped at the 333rd floor, and this is the lowest level of the whole prison. The 2 of them thought there would be no one here, but they didn't realize there was a child hiding under the bed. But Blackie didn't want to take out the dish of custard that he had been guarding all the way, because this is the message they want to send to the management. But he finally gave the little girl the milk hole. Drum thought it would be more useful to get the girl up there than the custard. Susan had told him that there were no children under the age of 16 allowed. If the little girl appeared in front of the management, then he would also be the message. So the 2 men sent the little girl up, and Glenn and Blackie were left at the bottom forever. The movie ends with a shot of the little girl riding up on the platform. No one knows if the management will change the rules of the place when they see him. And the movie actually has 2 endings. The first is the little girl going up. The second is Jelly going up. There's no little girl, but either way, it's inconclusive. In fact, this is a movie hidden in the real world. The floors in this movie represent different classes. The more people at the top of the society, the more resources they want. Those below can only use the resources left by others. No matter how hard they try, they can't break through the boundaries of class. All they can do is kill each other to keep themselves alive. How many people face such a bloody truth in their lives? In the face of absolute class, it's useless to try. It's useless to try your hardest, because that's all the resources you have access to. And the rich, even if we don't have to do anything, there's a lot of money and resources waiting for them. This is the cruelty of this world. In fact, 90% of the resources in society are in the hands of 10% of the rich, and we poor people have to fight for the 10% of resources. But in the end, whether it's the little girl who goes up or Jelly goes up, will it really change the rules here? The answer is no, because it's impossible for the executives at the top not to know what's going on down there. If they made such a rule, they must know what's going on down there. This is exactly what they want. Let's end with a quote. It's a classic. All roads lead to Rome, but some people are born in Rome.